The man had a badge, a clipboard, and the easy smile of someone who has never once been asked for identification. That smile was his entire business model, and I was about to become the first bad morning he'd had in a very long time. My name is Ray Dawson. I'm 44, and for 18 years I investigated insurance fraud before going private, which means I have spent my whole adult life in rooms with people who are lying to me pleasantly. You develop an instrument for it, a small internal gauge that leans hard whenever someone is too smooth, too rehearsed, too generous with details nobody asked for. When Duane Ferris knocked on my door in that quiet subdivision outside Atlanta, wearing a laminated badge that read HOA Compliance Officer and holding a clipboard fat with violation notices, that gauge didn't lean. It slammed against the pin and stayed there. He'd moved into the neighborhood only a few weeks earlier, a friendly newcomer who waved at everyone and remembered your dog's name before he remembered yours. Then, quietly, the friendliness grew a uniform. He began going door to door with citations. Unapproved mailbox, incorrect bin placement, a shrub 11 inches too tall. Each one carrying a compliance fee that he collected helpfully in cash right there on the porch. He knew the bylaws cold. He could recite article and subsection while you stood in your slippers holding a coffee going lukewarm. And most people, confronted at 8 in the morning by a confident man quoting rules at them, simply paid. $40 here, $60 there, cheaper than an argument, and far cheaper than the sick little feeling of being the neighbor who caused a scene. That was the real engineering of it. He priced every fee just below the threshold where a reasonable person decides to plant their feet and say no. He handed me a citation for non-compliant driveway sealant. My driveway, I'll note, had not been sealed in years, which was rather the entire problem, and informed me the fee was $75, cash preferred. I smiled back at him, matched his warmth watt for watt, and asked if I might see some identification confirming his authority to collect money on behalf of the association, just for my records. His smile flickered, one dropped frame of static, then rebooted. "Of course," he said smoothly. "I'll get that over to you this week." As he turned to go, I raised my phone and photographed his badge, the logo, the little registration number tucked into the corner, the same way you'd photograph a plate on a car leaving the scene. He never noticed. Men who lean on a badge rarely imagine anyone bothering to actually read it. I did not pay him. Instead, I did the only thing I know how to do, which is start counting. Over the next several days, I walked the neighborhood, knocking on the doors Duane had already worked, and a pattern assembled itself out of the anecdotes like a photograph coming up in a tray. Cash only, always. Flimsy, temporary receipts he promised to enter into the system later. Repeat visits to the same houses, 2, 3 times, and at least twice, homeowners had let him inside to inspect for interior violations, a sentence that made the retired fraud man in me want to lie down in a cool, dark room until it passed. One retiree in particular, a gentle widower named Mr. Alvarez, had paid Duane 4 separate times and was steeling himself to pay again that Friday, a $200 repainting non-compliance fee he intended to pull straight from his pension. I wrote all of it down, names, amounts, dates. I don't get angry at men like Duane. It clouds the work. I build spreadsheets about them instead. Then I made 2 phone calls that turned a neighborhood nuisance into a genuine case. The first was to the association's management company. I was bounced around a moment and landed on a woman named Pam, according to the chime of her voicemail greeting. And I kept it deliberately vague, just a puzzled homeowner asking whether the HOA had recently added some kind of inspector. She was breezy, a little distracted, clearly fielding 3 things at once, and told me lightly that she didn't think that was anything official, but people run all sorts of little neighborhood things. Then she was gone to another line. I noted the non-answer and thought nothing more of it at the time, which I would later find almost funny. The second call went to the board itself, and that is where the story took its first true turn, because the board president, a brisk man named Gerald Fontaine, was strangely, specifically unbothered. When I described Duane, the badge, the cash, the citations, Gerald paused a half-second longer than an innocent man pauses, then said, "Oh, that's probably just a volunteer initiative. Nothing to lose sleep over." A volunteer initiative, collecting cash door to door. I hung up with the gauge screaming. That pause rearranged the whole shape of the thing in my head, because one detail had never fit. Duane knew the bylaws too well. He quoted internal procedures, referenced specific past board votes, named exact reserve fund line items. A grifter who'd simply wandered into the subdivision could not know that. Somebody was feeding him from the inside. And the president of the board had just gone out of his way to wave me off a man impersonating an officer of that very board. So I started watching Gerald Fontaine. I took the badge apart first. I have a contact from my insurance years, a records analyst who owes me several favors and enjoys being asked, and I sent her the photo. Within a day, she'd matched the little registration number to a template used by a code enforcement office 2 counties over. Copied, and copied poorly. The logo subtly stretched, the seal a hair off true. Good enough to fool a homeowner squinting at dawn and nothing more. That same contact ran the pattern wider through a fraud database she has access to, and the sediment surfaced. A nearly identical compliance officer, different name, same script, had bloomed in 2 other subdivisions over the past 3 years, worked each one for a season, and evaporated, leaving behind fleeced retirees and no forwarding address. So Duane was serial, and now I could prove it. But the local knowledge still didn't square, and every time I turned it over, the arrow swung back toward Gerald. The president, who wasn't surprised, wasn't angry, and wanted me to stop asking questions. Duane, meanwhile, felt me circling, and men like Duane always respond to pressure the same way. He went on the offensive. He began telling neighbors, warmly, sorrowfully, that I was the real fraud, a suspicious character trying to elbow in on official collections. He taped a fresh citation to my front door, failure to cooperate with a compliance inspection, and when he hand-delivered a final notice, he stood a beat too long on my porch, eyes tracking past my shoulder into the house, the windows, the layout, the good electronics on the shelf. That was not an inspector's look. That was a man taking inventory. I kept my voice flat, kept my doorbell camera and the second camera under the eave both recording, and gave him absolutely nothing to work with. You do not brawl with a con artist. You let him keep talking, because every sentence is a loose thread, and a man like Duane will happily knit himself a noose if you just hold the yarn. The real fracture came out of the association's books. As a dues-paying member, I have a statutory right in Georgia to inspect the official records and financials, and I exercised it in writing, citing the code section directly so no one could perform confusion at me. What came back had a false bottom. Duane's cash fees, as expected, appeared nowhere in the ledger, confirming he had no legitimate tie to the association at all. But the real dues, the legitimate homeowner payments, didn't reconcile either. Across the previous year, a thin, steady trickle of money had gone missing somewhere between the mailbox and the recorded ledger. Never a dramatic sum in any single month, but relentless and patient, adding up to a genuinely serious number by the time you totaled the columns. There were 2 schemes running on my street at once: Duane's loud, gaudy sidewalk hustle, and a quiet, disciplined internal theft that his chaos conveniently buried. Because who goes hunting for a few missing Jews while there's a fake officer marching around collecting cash in broad daylight? And now I was certain I had my insider, and I was certain it was Gerald Fontaine. The president with the 2 long pauses. He had access. He had the knowledge Duane was so obviously being spoon-fed. He tried to steer me off with that volunteer line. I spent 2 full days building the case against Gerald, and it was clean, and it was tidy, and it was precisely the kind of clean and tidy that has humiliated me exactly often enough across my career to make me stop and put my pen down. Because a good fraud is a magic trick, and the first rule of every magic trick is that the hand you are invited to watch is the hand that wants watching. So before I set fire to a man's name,
I went back and picked up the one thread I dropped early and never followed.
Reassuring a nervous homeowner in those first days, Duane had name-dropped for credibility. The office signs off on all of this. Just ask Pam. She reconciles everything on Wednesdays. Pam, the breezy voice at the management company, the woman I'd filed under harmless before she'd even finished a sentence. Duane had told me who his inside person was in the second week, and I'd walked right past it because she was boring. I went back and pulled the deposit records, then cross-referenced them against who physically handled incoming payments and who reconciled the accounts. The floor gave way beneath the whole case. It was not the president touching the money. Gerald was pompous and evasive because Gerald was hiding something small and idiotic, an under-the-table sweetheart deal on the landscaping contract, the petty vanity graft of a man who likes being important, enough to make him dodge a stranger's questions, and nothing whatsoever to do with the missing dues. The person who received the dues, recorded the dues, and reconciled the dues was the office manager, Pam. The forgettable woman answering the phones. She had been quietly bleeding the association for a year, and when a traveling grifter named Duane drifted into her town, she had not reported him. She had recruited him. She'd handed him the bylaws, the internal votes, the reserve line items, the perfect local costume, precisely so his flashy fake officer noise would seize every eye on the street while she drained the real account in the dark. The loud thief was hired security for the silent one. She hadn't hidden behind Gerald by accident either. She'd spent a year cultivating him as exactly the kind of obvious suspect a man like me would find and pounce on. The last piece walked up to me on a young man's porch. The junior clerk at the management company, a kid named Marcus, barely 2 years out of school, had noticed his own login attached to reconciliations he didn't remember touching, and it had been quietly terrifying him for months. Pam had been routing her adjustments under his credentials, seasoning him to be the fall guy if the numbers ever caught fire. When I laid out what I'd found at his kitchen table, the relief and the fear hit him at the same time, and he went into a back room and came out with a folder, the internal statements, the deposit logs, the timestamps that put Pam's hands on both schemes and his own hands nowhere near them. He'd been keeping it, he admitted, because he didn't know who at the company he could trust. He'd been right not to. I didn't take it to a board meeting, and I didn't file a civil suit. I took the whole file to the police and the real board, sat with a detective who actually read every page, and let them build the operation around the one event Duane had already advertised to the entire neighborhood. His quarterly compliance collection day. Cash accepted at the community clubhouse, this Saturday, 9 to noon. My role, the detective made politely clear, was to hand it over and step back, and for once in my life, I was glad to. But first I drove to Mr. Alvarez's house and made sure he did not pay that Friday. I sat at his table and explained, slowly, what his 4 payments had actually been, and I watched 20 years come off his shoulders and settle onto the man who deserved them. Saturday, I stayed home and let the professionals work, which is its own kind of discipline. Duane arrived at the clubhouse with his clipboard, his laminated lie, a metal cash box, and a folding table he set up with the pride of a man opening a lemonade stand. He'd drawn a short line of resigned homeowners before the first plainclothes officer stepped up, held out 2 20s, and asked, loudly, clearly, for the recording, whether this was the official association fee. Duane assured him it was, took the cash, and wrote one of his beautiful temporary receipts. That receipt was the last thing he ever forged. They had him with the metal box open, the counterfeit badge in his pocket, and a bag of other people's grocery money on the table. Impersonation, theft by deception, identity fraud, and, once the 2 prior subdivisions were pulled into it, a stack of charges tall enough to keep him indoors for years. Across town, at nearly the same hour, but on a warrant that had taken its proper time to assemble, they arrested Pam at her desk, the forensic reconciliation and Marcus's folder already laid out against her line by patient line. The year of skimmed dues, the false trail toward a clerk who'd done nothing. The whole quiet architecture of it finally lit up. Gerald Fontaine resigned in disgrace over his grubby little landscaping kickback, which he thoroughly earned, and to this day, He has no idea how close my finger came to naming him for something that would have buried him. The management company was fired. Dues went cashless and independently audited. Restitution was organized for every fleeced retiree on the street, and Mr. Alvarez got back all 4 of his payments, plus the pension money he never had to touch. I walked home that afternoon, peeled Duane's last final notice off my front door, read it one more time for the pleasure of it, and dropped it in the trash on my way inside.
Channel author here, stepping out of Ray's shoes, because this one is a masterclass in the con behind the con. Where did they go wrong? Duane's fatal flaw was the badge itself, a lazy forgery with a copied registration number that came apart the instant one person photographed it instead of paying. Then he got chatty, name-dropping Pam for credibility, never dreaming he'd just handed the investigator the single thread that led straight to his own handler. And Pam's mistake was mistaking elegance for safety. She built a loud, ridiculous distraction to cover a quiet theft and even groomed a convenient suspect to absorb the blame. But reconciliation doesn't care how loud the noise is. Missing money leaves a trail, and the clerk she set up to fall became the witness who sank her. Practical takeaways. An HOA does not employ compliance officers who collect cash on your porch. Anyone who does is committing a crime, full stop. Ask for authority in writing and photograph the badge. Your right to inspect the association's financials is real and powerful. Reconciliation is where hidden theft goes to die. And be suspicious of the obvious villain, because the loudest wrongdoer in the room is very often paid cover for the quiet one counting the money. A question for you. If a friendly man with a badge showed up at your door quoting the bylaws chapter and verse and asking for cash, would you have paid just to make the discomfort go away, like most of the street did? Or would you have asked the one small question that brings the whole cathedral down? Tell me below. I want to know how many of you photographed the badge.